Yeah, I think that's a very good.
It's in that cemetery.
Yeah,
It's a little forgotten.
The one that we're fortunate to have him here, and we received a grant to have him here, and I'm super excited about the topic. I've already got to talk to him a little bit, and it's just like gives me all kinds of cold chills. So anyway, welcome, Leon, and I'll let him tell you more about him. Who knows better about him than me, right? So, all you.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay. The rise of policing in Indiana. This came out of my master's thesis that I wrote about the first African American police officers in the city of Indianapolis. Now, Indianapolis became the first city not first city, back up, fourth city in the United States and the first in Indiana to have African American police officers. So I've kind of adapted that whole research into what we're going to talk about today. So with that said, one of the things I want to actually bring out before I get started is there's oftentimes a misconception or people understand the difference between patrolling and policing. So before I get into it, patrolling, that concept, that idea comes out of what we might consider the Confederate South. And that area was being patrolled for runaway slaves and those kind of problems. And that's in the United States how patrolling becomes a real thing. Policing comes to the United States in 1829, in 1832, excuse me. It starts in London in 1829, and it is a form of social control in London. And Sir Robert Peel, the Home Secretary in England, in London, is bothered by trying to go to church on Sunday mornings, and he continually has to step over the revelers from Saturday night that are in the doorways of the liquor establishments or like possibly on the sidewalk. So he has to step over these folks to get to church on Sunday morning. So he wants to find a way to get those revelers out of his way. And the idea becomes policing. That concept of policing comes to Boston, Massachusetts in 1832. And it's the same thing they want to do there is they want to get people to stop drinking, partying in the streets, prostitution is on the street, all those kind of things. So what they do is they bring the concept of policing to Boston. And it works and starts to take off. And then it will come to Indianapolis in 1852. But the thing we have to think about is Indianapolis is on the frontier. It's part of the Western frontier in the 1840s, 1850s. And the frontier in Indianapolis really closes in 1847 when the railroad arrives. Because up until the railroad gets there, Indianapolis is not on a navigable waterway. You had to walk, ride a horse, ride a wagon, if you could find a trail to pull a wagon on. You could not get there on a boat. So the railroad became the way to start bringing in large numbers of people. And that happens in 1847. Also in the 1840s, you have the famine in Ireland, 1845, 1847. That drives, or no, it lasts longer than 1849 maybe. That drives many Irish out of Ireland to the United States. You have a war, a revolution that takes place in Germany in 1847, 1848, that drives many Germans out. So the Germans and the Irish who are coming to the United States actually come at a time when the railroads are moving people further inland than what had been possible before. That's one of the reasons you see so many more of them in the Midwest than what you had earlier. Also, we need to understand the Compromise of 1850, which brings us the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. That's the second Fugitive Slave Act, but there's no enforcement mechanism in Indiana. So what Indiana does in 1851 is that it rewrites the Constitution. We get the second Constitution of Indiana, 1851, and Article 13, which has been removed. But if you search the internet, you can actually find the verbiage of Article 13, which basically makes it illegal for African Americans to come into Indiana or live in Indiana. Okay, that's great. What's the enforcement mechanism? They don't have one. And the next thing that affects that is, anybody here ever heard of John Freeman? Heard that story? John Freeman actually has a federal court case. 3 years before the Dred Scott decision, John Freeman is claimed as a runaway slave, and this is in Indianapolis. Freeman actually fights and wins his court case. He's actually released. And Freeman, like I said, is claimed as a slave, and several prominent Indianapolis residents get together and form a committee, 3 of them being lawyers, and they travel all across the eastern United States to Ohio, to Virginia, D.C., Maryland, down to Georgia, and eventually up to Canada to actually find the man that is, his name was Sam. He actually found the man that was the runaway slave that this man, Prince Pleasant Ellington, was claiming that was John Freeman. He was in Amherstburg, Canada, and when they found him, he was sitting in front of his cabin with a pencil and paper writing poetry. He admitted that he was the runaway slave and even pulled his pants leg up to display the scars that had been described that he got in an accident. So he admits who he was, but he refused to come back to Indianapolis to testify for the trial. When the trial starts that Monday in August, Pleasant Ellington, the man who started it all, had left town late Sunday night, disappeared, has never been found. But that John Freeman case is another thing that brings police to Indianapolis. One I didn't put up here, but I'll mention is that it happens in Detroit around 1835. Thornton Blackburn and his wife, Ruthie, escaped Louisville, Kentucky, and then they got all the way up to Detroit and were gonna go across the river into Amherstburg, but got comfortable and stayed in Detroit for several years. They're discovered. The whole point of this story is that they're taken into custody, and while they're in jail, some of the African-American ladies in Detroit come to visit Ruthie in jail. One of them changes clothes with her. The guards don't notice. Ruthie walks out the front door. The other lady stays in the cell. The next morning, they realize the mistake, and they let the other lady, who's known to be a free woman of color, out. Her husband is still in jail. When they go to move him to the court that morning, there's a large crowd in front of the Wayne County Jail in Detroit. The crowd gets loud, rowdy, boisterous. And at some point, pushing and shoving, and eventually pistol shots are fired. The sheriff is injured. He dies several years later, supposedly of these injuries. But in the process, Thornton Blackburn is thrown into the back of a wagon of a moon-blind horse and taken through Detroit and down almost to Dearborn, and then they cross the river into Canada. And the Blackburns live the rest of their life in Canada. I tell you that story to say that there was what they wanted to call a riot behind this. And one of the fears was there was no police department in Detroit. All they had was the sheriff and a couple of deputies, and they had to call the militia, but it takes days sometimes to get the militia rounded up and together. And when you're in the middle of a quote riot, you don't have that kind of time. So the idea of a police force like they had in Boston becomes attractive. 10 years later, when we have this issue with Freeman in Indianapolis, the idea arises again, we don't have a ready force if something happens. Like in the case of John Freeman, what if Freeman's friends try to break him out? And that was mentioned in the newspaper that there was fear that was going to happen. And there was no one to call on to help the sheriff and his few deputies to maintain John Freeman in jail. So with all the issues of slavery and the other things, this should come out, you can't see it. Down here below that is what's known as the horse thief detective law. Most people never heard of that. Indiana, the same year that John Freeman happens, passes a horse thief detective law, and it also passes the first legislation for any city in Indiana to create a police department. So in 1854, Indianapolis starts its very first police department. The police department went along in Indianapolis pretty good for about a year, 18 months, and then they went to raid a drinking establishment run by a German person who his clientele was German. The Germans were notorious for their drinking very strong beer and their singing and joyous atmosphere in these bear gardens, they're called. And you could hear the singing out into the street. And unlike many of the more conservative Protestants in Indianapolis, the Germans didn't really mind drinking on Sunday. Neither did the Irish, although the Irish are known to be a little bit more rowdy with theirs, but they both would celebrate on Sundays. This made the Protestants upset. Also, the Germans were making a better beer product. So the Protestants who were making beer were losing money to these new Germans who made a much better product and people were going to buy it. So the police in Indianapolis in 1855 or 1856 go to the Hollywood bar to break up the drinking on Sunday, and they cause a small riot. The police officers were not wearing uniforms. They came in, they said they had identified themselves, but they probably couldn't be heard over the singing and started trying to snatch people off bar stools, and blows started being exchanged. And you have to understand, these are guys who work with their hands every day. They are stout, physically fit people, so they can hit hard. They've had a beer or two in them, they can take a punch pretty well. They don't feel the effects right away. The end result of that is the Indianapolis Police Department is disbanded behind this. It takes another year to bring the Indianapolis Police Department back in 1857, and it's been in existence from 1857 to 2007 when it became the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department, when the police department and the sheriff's department's operations merged. So that's, in a nutshell, how that policing happens in Indianapolis and how we get there. I wish I could show that, but it doesn't show up. Now it's coming up. Horse Thief Detective Association. Another thing about the Horse Thief Detective Association, that law passed in 1854 stayed on the books in Indiana until 1935. Most people forgot about it, but it was on the books. It is what makes the Ku Klux Klan so powerful in Indiana when it comes to power in 1922, is that D.C. Stevenson, who did not start the Klan, but turns it into a model political organization in Indiana, uses the Horse Thief Detective Association to his advantage. The Indiana State Police do not start until 1933. So there is no state police organization or operation. So the governor has no way of getting information except from the local elected county sheriffs. And if you're in the opposite party, how much information would they share, things like that? There was just no way of gauging that. And it became a problem in 1933 when we started having John Dillinger and Pretty Boy Floyd and the others robbing banks. That's when most of the states created state police departments. Before that, we had the Horse Thief Detective Association that in the rural areas where you had suspected runaway slaves coming in, or you had these disorderly German and Irish immigrants and their social habits, they created the Horse Thief Detective Association. What that basically means is you could go down to the county recorder, get 10 men, elect one as the captain, and for like a $5 or $10 fee, you could pay, and now you're a registered Horse Thief Detective Association protected by all of the incorporation laws in the state of Indiana. And there were numerous ones of them all across the state of Indiana. And that law gave the members of that association the legal authority of a constable, so they could arrest you. They were required to turn you over to the local county sheriff for detention and processing, but they could arrest you on the spot. So when Stevenson takes over the Klan and he takes over the Horse Thief Detective Association, suddenly he has an information network much larger than the governor's, because he has these, quote, Horse Thief detectives who are calling information into his office daily. And they're calling in, yes, legal information, but also political information, gossip. Who's doing what? Who's having what affair? Who's drinking? This information is coming into Stevenson a lot faster than this to the governor, and Stevenson is using that as a political weapon. So that's why the Horse Thief Detective Association becomes a real problem. It does allow the rural folks to police their area because they don't have the numbers of people to pay into the tax base to support a police department. Indianapolis does. The law in 1854 allowed any city with 3,000 or more residents to form any community, let me back up, to form a city. And when they did that, it gave them the authority to tax their residents to pay for police protection, fire protection, public health, and public works. That allowed Indianapolis to create a police department. The rural areas couldn't do that. So the compromise is create these volunteer organizations that later become very problematic. At the time, it seemed like such a great idea that we can get policing for nearly free, and the residents, the citizens, will do it. But it becomes problematic nevertheless, and eventually in 1935, the law is quietly taken off the the books. Okay. I mentioned patrolling earlier. The Great Famine, it's another one of the outside influences bringing people in, and it changes the politics in Indiana. The same with that German Revolution I mentioned a minute ago, where you're starting to get large numbers of Germans. Another thing with the Germans, when they come in, they speak a totally different language. They dress differently. They have different customs. So they are problematic when they show up. The Irish, many of them spoke English or a derivation of English that people could understand. The Irish, one of their biggest problems were most of them were Catholic. And they're in a conservative Protestant area with their Catholic beliefs. That becomes another problem. Like I said a minute ago, the Horsey Protective Association, they form these things in states all across the United States. It is not unique to Indianapolis. Indianapolis, or Indiana, just has one of the most effective ones nationwide. And I mentioned the Dred Scott decision. Again, Dred Scott, when that decision was made in 1857, that sends chills throughout the Black community all across the country. And one of the things people need to understand or keep in mind is that about 2/3 of the way of that multi-page document, Chief Justice Roger B. Taney writes, the Negro has no rights that the white man is obligated to respect. The Dred Scott decision has never been overturned. Technically, it is still on the books. It's just not used, it's not implemented. Now, the comparison to that, and I think I have it up here, is the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, and it's coming. Plessy versus Ferguson is overturned in 1954 with the Brown versus Board decision. That Supreme Court decision overturns the Plessy decision. The the Dred Scott decision has never been challenged. So what he says in there still is the rule of the law, the rule of the land. Also, we need to understand the presidential election of 1876. That's the one that brings Rutherford B. Hayes to the White House. That's the really controversial election when Congress actually decided who won the presidential election because it was technically a tie. And all this horse trading went on back and forth behind the scenes in the back rooms. And when they're done, Rutherford B. Hayes becomes president. And one of the promises Rutherford B. Hayes makes in order to become president is he ends or he dismantles over time Reconstruction in the South. In other words, all the protections they put in place to protect the enslaved African Americans after the Civil War, Hayes is the one who starts to dismantle them. And this becomes the rise of Jim Crow, and it becomes a part of and a problem with policing from 1876 coming forward. And one of the things I like to point out to people is, think about it like this. African Americans were really not put in prisons and were not dealt with by the legal system until after 1865, really not to 1876. The police did not kill African Americans in large numbers before that time period. When I say police, I mean law enforcement, any law enforcement. And the main reason for that was African Americans were not people, they were property. And if you kill a slave, that's destruction of property. You could be jailed for that. You could be fined in court. You'd have to pay for the cost of that slave. An industrial slave, like some of my family members, would cost an average of like $1,500 to $2,000, where a field slave, an agricultural slave, would be $300 to $500. So killing a trained industrial slave was a very expensive proposition, and it didn't happen. So basically, African Americans are protected, believe it or not, by the laws the way they are structured. And that doesn't become a problem until after 1876, when Reconstruction ends, when Rutherford B. Hayes is elected president. And hopefully I have him here. I do not, let me stop talking about this. We'll go back to it later. 1876 is when there's a shooting in Indianapolis of an African-American man. There's a trial ends badly, and we get Black police officers in 1876, 19 years after the police department started. So for the first almost 20 years, the Indianapolis Police Department is all white. The Indianapolis Fire Department is all white. That changes in May 1876, and we'll come back to that in a few slides. Most of you probably never heard of Frederick L. Hoffman. Anybody? Hoffman was a actuary. He worked for the Prudential Insurance Company. What he did in his spare time was crunch numbers on the United States. And he became friends with many people over at the Census Bureau. And Hoffman writes one of the first treatises on African-American life in the United States. And he writes a document called Race, Traits, and Tendencies of the American Negro, which basically says that African-Americans are criminals from birth. They can't help themselves. They are not smart enough to not be enslaved and not to be a problem, and that they need white supervision. This is one of the first documents produced like this in the United States. It is a 390-page, 3-volume magazine article. It comes out, not coincidentally, 6 months before the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. Later in that year, W.E.B. Du Bois publishes The Philadelphia Negro, which pushes back against everything that's in this document. This document, most people have forgotten and don't know about. You can find it online, easy enough. But like I said, most people don't talk about it. There's the Plessy decision that comes out, like I said, just about 6 months later, that is posted. Plessy versus Ferguson is the decision that actually codifies discrimination in the United States. It is the decision that creates separate but equal. And that is what Brown versus Board undoes, is to say that separate is not equal, cannot be equal. You can't have two separate systems. It does not work. But that is what the Supreme Court based their decision on. And there's no doubt that they had read Frederick Hoffman's 390-page diatribe on African Americans. Okay. I just talked about this a minute ago. IPD and IFP were totally white until 1976. And the question becomes, why? What drove them? This is how I got into this, is when I started trying to dig back into it, I found some old personnel files, and all of the African Americans I could find, the earliest ones, all of their files start May 19th, 1876. There are 4 African American firemen, 3 African American policemen, and they all start on the same day. That's not a coincidence. Why did that happen? What was going on? And it took a while to untangle it, but I get to this. Well, before I get to that, this is March 1876. Yeah, this is the issue. Edward Phillips is wanted by the police. There is a warrant for his arrest for carnal knowledge of a white woman. He's an African American. Basically, he's wanted for interracial dating, which was against the law in Indiana. And the police had several times caught up with him, only to find out he got away. He would take off running, and he was a little bit more fleet of foot than the police officer. He got away. And this happened 4 or 5 times until the night of March 1st, when they caught up with him when he was sitting in a house with one of his friends and several other people. And the police go to the house. There's 3 of them. 2 go to the front. 1 stations himself in the back to be able to watch the back of the house. And it's a double. And they're not sure which side he's on, so they knock on the doors on both sides. A woman named Mary Clark opens up the one side, and they announce who they are and that they're looking for Edward Phillips, yada, yada, yada. They go into the house, into the living room. It's March 1876, before the electric light bulb, so the only light you have is coal oil lamps or candles. So it's fairly dark. The policeman asks for a lamp so he can read the warrant and he can actually see the people's faces. He recognizes Phillips. Phillips admits to who he is and says that he will go with them. So the 2 police officers go out the front door. Phillips gets his hat. He goes out the front door behind the police officers. They walk down a set of stairs, and when they get to the bottom, Phillips immediately takes off running, and he runs around behind the house with the 2 police officers in hot pursuit behind him, yelling for the police officer in the back to get him. Here he comes. But at 9 o'clock in March 1st in Indianapolis, it's dark. This police officer only sees a shadowy figure coming around that corner. He doesn't know who he is for sure, so he hesitates as the other 2 keep yelling for him to stop him, to shoot him. The police officer doesn't do that, and then the lead police officer, his name was Wambaugh, John Wambaugh, fires, in his own words, 2 warning shots. Phillips keeps running. So he levels his pistol and fires a third one as Phillips is going over a fence. And he shoots Phillips in the back below the belt. Phillips goes over the fence and runs another couple yards, and then he collapses. The police officers catch him. One threatens to beat him. The other policemen, ask him why he ran. Phillips is saying he shot. They don't believe him. One thing after another. And then finally, Phillips keeps telling him he can't walk, he shot. And a citizen who was there just says he would take him to the police station in a wheelbarrow if they just would not abuse him or don't beat him anymore. I'll put him in a wheelbarrow and I'll push him to the police station, which was a little over a mile from where they were. They drag and carry Phillips several blocks to the streetcar, put him on a streetcar, ride him downtown a mile, get him off and drag and help him another several blocks to the police station, put him in a jail cell at the Indianapolis Police Headquarters and leave him there. The next morning, he is found by a doctor from the county hospital who's making his rounds to the jail at Indianapolis Police Lockup. And he notices Phillips doesn't move when he comes through, and he rouses him, and Phillips is semi-conscious. He tells him he's shot. The doctor asks where. He tells him. The doctor rolls him over, pulls his pants down. There's a perfect little round hole in his behind. And the doctor becomes concerned because Phillips is not bleeding. But there's a bullet wound and there's no exit wound. So the doctor realizes Phillips is bleeding internally. He's losing blood inside and not bleeding out. And he is semi-conscious enough that he knows things are not right. The doctor orders Phillips taken to City Hospital. At the same time, he gives him a shot of morphine, which he knows will lower his blood pressure, but Phillips complains of being in a lot of pain. They take him to the hospital. This is now about 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning. Phillips gets there before lunchtime. The doctors at the hospital say that his wounds are mortal, he's gonna die. And some white people in Indianapolis, one of them being a lawyer, comes to the hospital because they know Phillips personally. The lawyer, who is also a justice of the peace, takes Phillips' dying declaration. Phillips tells him his story, and they tell him, you're gonna die. Yes, I know I'm gonna die. And he tells the story, and then he makes his mark, and these people countersign that this is Phillips' statement. The police and the prosecutor are not interested in this case and take no interest in it. That judge, that justice of the peace, goes to the Marion County coroner and convinces the coroner with that statement to hold an inquest. At the inquest, people come in and give testimony. With that testimony, they convinced the prosecutor now you have to have a trial because now the justice of the peace has ordered his constables to go find these two police officers. The third police officer was not charged because he wasn't the one who fired and he wasn't with the one who fired. He's standing in the back, he's witnessing this, and he comes in and testifies and tells the story. And those two police officers are put on trial. They are tried, found not guilty. Now, this happens in March 1876. The trial happens in April. The primary elections are the first week of May, and the Black community is already in an uproar. The 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution now is going to take full effect in 1876 with that presidential election. Now, African Americans across the country are going to vote for the first time en masse in a presidential election. And the minister at Bethel AME Church and the minister at Allen Chapel and the minister at Second Baptist go together in a group and basically threaten the mayor and tell him that you need to do something. This cannot stand. The courts have now made it legal to shoot anybody who's Black because they ran. That's what's happened here. And the crime that he was charged with and was interracial dating. Something's got to be done. And at first the mayor is kind of resistant to all this, but then the ministers tell him, okay, well, around 5,000 to 6,000 African-American men were going to vote in the May primary in just about a week or two from the time this meeting happens. And if you don't do something, we are going to vote for the other side. We will vote you out. And at that point, the mayor takes them seriously. He realizes that there's enough of these men who are going to vote that can throw the election in a city that's almost 50-50. That many votes at one time to one side or the other throws the election. The mayor asked them to give him time. He would get something done, be patient. They take him at his word. The election happens. The African Americans vote. Republican John Caven and his whole ticket are reelected in the primary. And to his word, the following week, Caven holds a meeting with the Indianapolis Police Department. There are 75 members of the police department when the meeting starts. When the meeting ends, the police department's down to 50. 10 of those men were on a callback list that could come back at when they needed more people. The other 15 were permanently gone. They would never be rehired. 2 of the 15 were John Wambaugh and John Scanlon. And they disappear into history. We don't know whatever becomes of those two. With that said, there are now 2 black policemen and a black jailer that are hired. The following week, which is the 19th, this is where the 4 firemen and 3 policemen, or 4 firemen, 2 policemen, and a jailer all come in all at the same time behind this one incident. And that changes, well, that's what I was looking for. That's Hoffman's document, his diatribe, as I like to call it. It's an interesting but racist, boring document if you want to take the time to try and actually read it. It's available online. Most people, like I said, never heard of it. Hopefully if you take a picture of that, it'll actually take you to that site where that document is located. And I was gonna have a QR code with this one, it didn't come up with it for some reason. Hopefully being blown up won't hurt it. Did it come up?
Yeah.
Good, cool.
And I took a picture of it for Facebook.
Trust me, like I said, at 300 plus pages, it is a boring read, but you do see the mindset of the United States in the late 19th century. This is another document I found, another newspaper article, and it's talking about Plessy versus Ferguson in the Jim Crow era. This is what we're talking about. This is what it looks like. Then this came out of the newspaper, and this is not the worst of some of the writing you actually see, where they throw around racial slurs and epithets, you know, with abandon in 19th century newspapers. Jumping from 1876 to 1906, most of you never heard about this one. I included this because this now shows how policing is starting to change and become very problematic. In 1906, 3 Indianapolis police officers, Charles Russell, Edward Petticord, and John Cousins, who's not mentioned here, are looking for 2 men, 2 African-American men, who were involved in a fight in a pool hall. And they come to this house, and it's, here again, it's evening, it's around 9 o'clock when they finally get here. They've been looking for him all day. This is actually behind the house, and this is a set of shacks, sheds, houses, whatever you want to call them. They're built in the backyard of the house. And it was on Indianapolis' near northwest side. They get to the house, and Edward Petticord goes to the front door. Cousins and Russell go in around to the back. And as they turn into the backyard, they come into this little courtyard area, they encounter several men, 2 of them being Jesse Coe and George Williams. And for whatever reason, Russell decides he wants to search these men, and he starts demanding information. This is before policing becomes professionalized. This is when you just hired somebody that was big enough and bold enough to just go up and approach people and get demanding and also be willing to get physical. So he grabs Jesse Coe, who is a smaller man, by the arm and jerks him over to him and starts trying to search him. Jesse Coe jerks away and utters a couple of profanities. It escalates, and Coe pulls a pistol out of his pocket and he shoots Russell right on the spot. And then he runs between those 2 buildings out into the alley and disappears. At the same time, John Cousins has pulled his pistol and has his pistol aimed on these other men who are standing in this courtyard. And as Edward Petticourt hears all this commotion, comes running around the side of the house, he sees Jesse Coe run, he sees Russell on the ground, and he sees that Cousins has his pistol pointed at the other men. So at that point, Petticourt ran into the alley after Jesse Coe. George Williams runs behind Petticourt and shoots Petticourt, and he falls across the fence, and George Williams disappears. Williams is arrested several hours later, and he's jailed, and eventually he's convicted, and he is sentenced to prison to be hanged at Michigan City, and he is hanged. He is the 13th and last man hanged in the state of Indiana. The next man up got the electric chair. Jesse Coe disappears. It's not clear exactly what happened to him, how he got away, but it's believed or was suggested that he hid in the crawl space of a house of a relative until sometime the next day. And that he actually heard the police come in, search the house, walk around, they never came in the crawl space where he was. And the next day he walks out of town wearing a dress. He has a dress over top of his clothes, and he walks on the railroad tracks to get out of town. And he basically walks back to Cumberland County, Kentucky, which is on the Tennessee-Kentucky state line. Jesse Coe, also I didn't mention, is a man with a volatile temper. And Jesse Coe, a few years before that, was in the Tennessee prison for killing a man who actually shot Jesse Coe first. There was a dispute. Jesse Coe was a known marksman. This man pulled a pistol and shot Jesse Coe, and Jesse Coe took the pistol from him and then killed him with his own pistol. And he spent 2 years in the Tennessee State Prison. This was a white man he shot and killed. And the one reason he only got 2 years was that the man shot Jesse Coe first. So the Tennessee authorities felt like Jesse Coe needed something, but he was also trying to defend himself. After those 2 years, he gets out. His family said he was never the same. He leaves Kentucky, leaves Tennessee, goes back to Kentucky, then it comes from Kentucky to Indianapolis. And Coe is a volatile individual, and that's who George Russell ran across that night in the dark and didn't know it. Jesse Coe disappears, and it takes 2 more years to find Jesse Coe down at the old homestead. Jesse Coe is located, and he is ambushed by the sheriff in the neighboring county and his posse, and then they set him up in an ambush. They shot him and then carried him on their shoulders for about a mile to get back to where they tied their horses, threw him over the back of one of the horses, and then rode him another 4 or 5 miles till they got to the county line, where they got a farmer's wagon and threw him in the back of that. And it took that farmer's wagon about another 15 miles into Tompkinsville, Kentucky, where they had his body in bond, put him in a pine box, called the Indianapolis Police Department, says, "Hey, we got Jesse Coe." Oh, I left out part of that story. Between Tompkinsville and Glasgow, Kentucky, where they got on the train, they take him from Tompkinsville to Glasgow on a horse-drawn stagecoach. They throw him in the floor of the stagecoach. The sheriff, his wife, and one of the deputies ride on the stagecoach, and Jesse Coe's body is laying at their feet, probably under their feet for this ride. When they get to Glasgow, his body's in bond, put in a box, and then put on a train to Louisville, and from Louisville to Indianapolis. At Indianapolis train station, he's taken off the train. This is the old Indianapolis police headquarters, was torn down in the 1960s. This is, like I said, 1908. If you look at that photograph, you can see the people out there. There are horse-drawn carriages. These people are lining up to see Jesse Coe's body. The Indianapolis Police Department paid $1,500 to the sheriff of Cumberland County, or excuse me, Monroe County, Kentucky. He was from the neighboring county, not even the county where Jesse Coe was shot and killed. They paid him $1,500 for his body. The deal basically was they wanted to pay $1,500 to get Jesse Coe alive. They didn't get him alive. They got him dead, and they didn't specify that in the announcements. So they gave him the $1,500. One of Jesse Coe's distant relatives got $50 for setting up the ambush. They get him here. Once he's identified by officials, they put his body on display. News travels through Indianapolis. And this is Indianapolis turning out to see the body of the man they paid $1,500 to get. And they had racialized this to no end. Jesse Coe was labeled a Kentucky bad man, a Negro terrorist, and the list just goes on. And this is basically a sideshow. We don't do things like this today, but this is what they did. They got Jesse Coe was out squirrel hunting with this other family member. And they took Jesse Coe's pistol and his rifle, brought it back, and they made a display that hung in this police station on the wall for a number of years, along with a photograph of Jesse Coe's dead body and photographs of the 2 dead police officers. This is what policing looked like before it was professionalized, and these stories are all over Indiana. There are some from the early 20th century from this part of Indiana where crowds went on a vigilante hunt for someone accused of a crime. And it didn't have to be murder of a police officer. It could be murder, it could be rape, you name it. But all over Indiana, this happens. And it really doesn't stop happening until after World War II, when most of these areas get police departments, and then police departments start to professionalize, that we no longer see this kind of activity. I think the last case I can think of for sure that this happened is August 1930, when Thomas Shipp and Abraham Smith are taken from the Grant County Jail in Marion, Indiana, and lynched on the courthouse yard. They were accused of murder and rape, and they took actually 3, with James Cameron with the 3rd, who was a 16-year-old. Cameron survived, they let him go, but they lynched Smith and Shipp. And that's one of the most notorious lynching photographs in US history. Most people have seen it. That's how that happens. Like I said, that's the last time this happens, but happens in Indianapolis. So there is this myth in Indianapolis that, oh, these things just don't happen here. In Indiana, it just doesn't happen here. Yes, it does, or yes, it did. And that's why I included that one. Shooting people, the police shooting people, fleeing felons, went on in the United States until 1985. Say it again, 1985, not 1985, when the US Supreme Court finally said, you can't just shoot someone who's a suspected fleeing felon. You have to have reason to believe that they are a threat. And this case was a teenager who the police officer said he saw that he was not armed, and he was running away from the police officer trying to climb the fence when the police officer shot this 15, 16-year-old in the back and killed him. Kind of sounds like the 1876 case of Edward Phillips in Indianapolis, shot in the back going over a fence. And the judge in that case in 1876 told an Indianapolis newspaper he felt that the police officers who were put on trial for murder were overcharged. This is 1876, and they're already talking about being overcharged for shooting African Americans. That case in 1876 is the second oldest case. I thought it was the first, but I found out about 6 months before that, there was a case in Baltimore where a white police officer shot an African American, and he actually was put on trial. He was convicted. Where here in Indianapolis or in Indiana, the police officers were not convicted. They were allowed to go free. So this is a long-term problem throughout the United States and throughout Indiana. And like I said, even though we have this fleeing felon decision by the US Supreme Court, still today, we have people who get shot by the police under questionable circumstances. And this is a list of sources that you can use and I used to create this thing. There are federal records or state records. There are newspapers, and the newspapers here are primarily from Indianapolis, if not all from Indianapolis. The Indianapolis Recorder is an African-American newspaper. One thing you have to remember when you get back into the 19th century is that there were very few African-American newspapers. The Indianapolis Recorder doesn't actually go into publication until the 1890s. So even it was not around at the time. And there is, let me say this, about a 10-year gap in the Recorder collection in any library you go into. Before libraries started to actually save newspapers and put them into like an archival file, there was a fire at the Indianapolis Recorder office, and it burned a 10-year section of the Recorder from the 1920s. So the Ku Klux Klan era in Indiana is not covered in that newspaper because it doesn't exist. What we do have are the white newspapers. There are a couple of others in the newspapers. The black newspapers, just like the white newspapers, take political positions. And the other one would have been the Indianapolis Freeman, which was a Republican newspaper. And it took the Republican line. And understand that the Republican Party and Democratic Party changed positions on almost every political stance in the 1930s when Franklin Roosevelt rose to office. So what was liberal was Republican, what was conservative was Democrat, until the 1930s when they switched positions on most social and political issues. There are a great number of books that I would recommend that would help you understand this. Listed out here, Hoffman is listed, although it's not a book, it's actually a magazine article, but I recommend it. Emmylou Thornborough writes several books on Indiana history that are very helpful in this situation. And she focuses on Indiana. These are still more books about the same topic. And that was my express version of how we got policing in Indiana. I want to leave a little bit of time for questions to talk about this. Policing as we know it today starts in 1876, but it really doesn't professionalize until 1946, 47. And it is still evolving. When you hear policing, you think about policing, you should understand that policing is not about crime prevention. It's about social control. Police cannot prevent crime. They can investigate crimes. They can try to do things to try and hopefully keep crime from starting, but it's not about crime prevention. It is about social control. And that's one of the biggest mistakes we make in this country when we think about police and policing. I couldn't have answered everybody's questions.
No, I have one. I'll start us off.
Okay.
So, I had to laugh at the horse thief detectives. I just kind of, that tickled my tummy a little bit. But my question related to that is, because it amazes me, because of course it's not the structure today that we can just get a group of 10 people and now we have this.
Legalized vigilantism.
Yeah.
Yes.
So to follow up with that, so I mean, when we think of policing, or when I think of policing, they're paid employees.
Yeah.
So was there any form of payment for them, or was just the power?
It was just a power thing.
It was just a power thing.
There were paid police officers like in Indianapolis and the fight. They were professionally paid police officers, firefighters that started in 1854. But like I said, people may think when that happened, it was, yes, the slavery issue was a part of it, but at the same time that that's happening, you also have immigrants. You have German and Irish immigrants who are coming in who were also seen as being problematic. So it is a struggle. And then when you come to the more, I don't want to say rural, but less populated parts of Indiana, they were more tending to lean toward the volunteer Horse Thief Detective Association model. And other states did this. It seemed like a solution for the moment, but then we all know how vigilantism can turn out. Once they get started, what's to stop them from tying someone to a tree? In which they did quite often. The most famous case comes from the 1850s in northeast Indiana, north of Fort Wayne. I'm slipping on the county, but they actually, this man was white. He and a couple of others were running a thievery ring through the county up there, and the farmers had gotten tired of them. They were stealing saddles and harnesses and farming tools, you name it, whatever was nailed down, they were taking it. They finally figured out who they were, and they tracked them down, and they found one of them. They accused of being the leader. They took him back to town, and to the outskirts of town, took him into a two-story building on the second floor, and they kept him in this room all night. And this group of men, in an ad hoc fashion, pronounced him guilty, decided he would be hanged the next morning. One of the men went to find this man's wife and brought her back so she could have a last moment with him to talk to him. They talk for a few minutes, and she leaves the room. They come and get him, and they take him down the stairs, load him in a wagon, and he sits on his own pine box in the wagon and rides to the town square, and they hang him. There was a county prosecutor, there was a county sheriff, there were lots of other county officials, but the men in this vigilante association lined up on their horses 2 by 2, and there must have been 20 or 25 of them, to lead this procession in, and a couple right along behind it. and this man on this wagon, and they did it and hung him. And then later, the man who actually was the sitting prosecutor writes the story out, writes like a novel to describe all of this. And it gets published, if you will, in the 1850s, for what that's worth, but enough that it's now public and he now has second thoughts because he's just implicated himself in a murder, a lie, and he names other people that are involved in this. Nothing ever becomes of it.
And just for clarification, they're all basically self-nominated for this group, so there's no, I think of background checks or, I know that that's not what it is, but no like letters of recommendations, there's nobody saying, these are really upstanding citizens that we want patrolling and protecting, they're just, hey, I got a gun, I'll do it, is that?
They are volunteers. Some of them, because they're known to other members, oh yeah, he'll be a good member. And some of these force and protection associations grew in numbers, to 50, 75, maybe 100 members. And you could have one in each little community. In Marion County, there must have been more than a dozen horse thief detective associations in Marion County. And that's probably on the low end of the numbers. But then there could be, 100 members to one of these things. And they were in every county in the state. All you had to do was just get 10 people to sign their name. They wanted to be a part of it and elect a captain, a leader, and then pay that fee at the county registrar's office, and you're in. If you go over to Wabash College, down in the basement of their library building, there's an archive down there. They actually have documents in that archive, and they'll show you of some of these groups that they wrote up really nice constitutions for their organization, or they have things like badges and all other kinds of paraphernalia. One of the things the lady there showed me, there's a box, a small wood box with a slide top on it, and it's full of like marbles, if you will. These round balls about the size of marbles. All of them are beige or white, with the exception of one. It's black. So when you're like drawing straws, in this case, they hold it up, you couldn't see them reach in, everybody's pulling out one, and someone would get the black. That is how they decided who would do what, who got the dirty job or who got the lucky job. And this was a part of the paraphernalia for one of those groups over in, I think that's Wabash County, that school is located. Years ago, they tell me the librarian there started collecting this stuff and created this collection. It's one of the biggest ones in the state of Indiana. Most nobody knows that it exists. And then when you get in there and actually start looking at it, and you start finding out that there is this huge history of policing and violence in Indiana, and it's held in little Wabash College, his library of all places.
David Cockerham had a question.
Yeah, Jamie Cox is gonna read you a question from one of the online people.
Okay.
Yeah. So we have a question that says, what kind of reform model of policing would you suggest that would move policing away from social control and vested economic interests toward protecting the public and community service? Do we need a different model of policing in the 21st century?
I think we need to rethink what policing is and what it's capable of doing. We ask too much of police officers. When you think about the society's problems, many of the crimes that are being caused are either being caused by people who are suffering from mental disabilities and challenges, or people who are basically poor. They're stealing because they're poor. They're stealing because they're hungry. They're causing some type of a nuisance crime because they can't help themselves. Putting a person who's having a mental breakdown in a prison doesn't help that person, nor does it help the other people in the prison, nor does it help society, because at some point, that person's gonna get back out again and go through the same process. And a few years ago in Indianapolis, they built a new Marion County jail. And part of that jail complex, when they built it, is a separate mental health facility to try and figure out if this person is just a criminal or if this person is mentally ill or needs some type of medical social assistance that you don't get in the criminal justice system. It's not a perfect solution, but it is at least a recognition of a larger societal problem that policing, courts, and jails are just ill-equipped to deal with. So I think we need to really have a long, hard discussion and thought process of what do we want policing to do? What can it do? And is there a better way of handling certain issues? Anytime someone picks the phone up and calls 911, you typically will get the police and possibly the fire department or EMS. But if a person's having a mental breakdown, you don't need the police. Probably EMS and some mental health professionals to deal with that problem. The police are not the ones to go there. The police are like using a sledgehammer to kill flies. Yes, ma'am.
So I recently heard, and this isn't Indiana, but I heard of Cop City that is
It's in Georgia, in Atlanta.
in Georgia. Yeah, so is this something that you think could, I guess, help with policing and how it's implemented in today's society, or do you think it could become a bigger problem for the world?
I am not totally up on the Cop City issue, but what I will say is what I know of it and what I know of policing is what most of us don't think about is there is a police culture. And what I mean by culture, all of us at some level are involved in culture, perform culture. So police are a subset of our society. And what they have managed to do over time is create this, when you hear them talk, they speak a different language. Oftentimes you hear them say like, well, they exited the car rather than I got out, I exited. But that's the way they speak. They typically don't say gun, they say weapon. If you look at how they dress, most of them will wear a short military style haircut, including the bird off sides, almost the Geronimo Indian type haircut. I'm describing that wrong, forgive me. But I think you know what I'm talking about. They start to dress and talk in a different way. Once they start doing that, they start seeing themselves as different, as apart from the rest of society. And they start to believe that it's not just policing now becomes good versus evil. It becomes an idea that they are an occupying force. They need to come in, lay down the law, you know, crackheads, all those kind of things you hear people say in movies and TV shows. It's true, there is a police culture. That's what it looks like. That's a big part of the problem. And most police officers will argue with you when you start telling them that because they've never taken a step back to look and see what's causing some of this. In the case of everybody, I think has probably seen the not Rodney King, but he's another one. The one in Minneapolis, George Floyd. When George Floyd was being arrested, once they had him on the ground, they got him in the car and pulled him out because he wouldn't get all the way in the car. And then they kneeled down on him to hold him to the ground. That went on for almost 10 minutes. There was no reason to do that. Basically, once you have someone's hands firmly locked behind their back, they're incapacitated. The only thing you can do to make them even more so is to restrain their feet. You can do that with a nylon strap, they carry those with them, or with the larger manacles that look like the handcuffs that will fit the legs. There are ways to restrain people. To actually kneel on him like that was not necessary. And the fourth police officer who stood between the crowd was trying to stop him, you know, and basically in defiance, if you come any farther, you know, you'll be arrested, you'll be shot, you know, you'll be dealt with like this. And them not thinking when this man said that he could not breathe. That's a culture mindset. One of the best examples of that, I don't have access to it, but if you start Googling it, you can find there's a NPR reporter named Robin Samian. Back when you had the issue with the man in New York, his name escaped me now. But he is arrested, he's on the ground, he's the one that said he couldn't breathe, he ended up dying. Robin Samian interviews several police officers. She interviews one white female officer that close friends with her, and she doesn't reveal her name, but you can hear her voice. And she said that he was lying. And even though they watched this video after the man had died, and she was saying, but he's saying he can't breathe. She said, if he couldn't breathe, he couldn't talk. And the police officer will tell you in a minute that they know this person's fake, and everybody fakes, you know, the first time they get caught, you know, oh, I need to go to the hospital. And they ignore, you know, the people's complaints or cries. and then you have these kind of tragedies keep repeating themselves. That's a culture mindset that you're right, they're wrong, it's gonna be your way. That's another problem with policing, is that oftentimes when people run from the police and get shot, it's not that they committed a crime. It's the fact that it's defiance. I told you to stop, you didn't stop. Now I'm gonna use whatever means necessary to stop you, including killing you. And then the courts rarely enforce any kind of a mechanism against the police officer for what he's done, for the violence he's inflicted. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I like the point about the culture. But I don't know if I see it as a separate culture, but that the way we police is a reflection of deep values and behaviors of our own sort of culture. How we police says something about how our society is sort of sees itself. Because I can see that policing in other areas, like even in the classroom, or how we approach education in terms of that social sort of control, and finding those who break the rules or those who transgress, and there's punishment. And you can sort of trace that. So I see this as how we police is a reflection of a deep-seated culture that we have. And we could say that was brought over from, with the sheriffs, and how that was tied into the feudal system, because our policing sort of reflects that sort of hierarchy. So
it does, and you bring up a very good point, and I don't remember the book I read this in, but the author makes this example in schools with dealing with younger children, elementary school, first, second, third, fourth grade, little kids. You have a teacher, a young, let's say white teacher, in an urban school who was raised in a suburban environment, a predominantly white school, a predominantly white culture, if you will. She's in this classroom with these predominantly Black kids. She tells the kids to do something, but it's the way that she says to do it that some of the kids don't necessarily respond to as fast. And then she gets irritated with them, and then will ask the child, "What did I tell you to do?" And the kid will look at her, "I don't know." Well, you gave the kid multiple instructions. And I even found this with my own kids when they were small, is that when you give them instructions like that, the first thing the kid does is the last thing you said to do. So they go run and do what you said to do. And then everything else you said, they forgot. It's not that they were ignoring you. You gave them too many things at one time for them to keep up with. And then you said, "Do this." And they went and did it. And then they started doing something else. And then if you ask them, "Did I tell you to do that?" or "What did I tell you to do?" they revert back to whatever the last thing was you said, and they did that. So in coming from a home with Black parents, or with a school with predominantly Black kids, the Black teachers, don't talk to the kids that way. They will tell the kid to do this, sit down, do this like this, and then let it go. The white teacher from the other culture who was raised a different way doesn't realize it's not that the kids are defying her, because she sees it as defiance. It's not what they're accustomed to. And you're talking about a young child who doesn't know any better. So they're again, society, culture, we don't understand, how things work in a larger, complicated society. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to add on to that, because this is just a personal experience for me with my own children, but in that example, and I actually had my kids going to a counselor when they were younger for some things. But one of the things that I was told was, one, don't give them more than 3 tasks at any given time, because then nothing will be done rather than the tasks you assign. But also the communication aspect that applies to all of this, because they have to be so specific. Like, you can't tell a kid to go clean their room, because that means nothing to them. But if you tell them to go to their room and pick up their clothes, go to the room and dust the furniture, go to the room, and I expect you to sweep the floor, then those are doable tasks. But if you communicate in an overwhelming fashion and where our aspects are looking at it from completely different definitions, then it can't be reconciled. So I'm, and I mean, and I feel like this applies to kind of some of the concepts.
It does, and to take it another step in that direction, using myself for an example. My grandmother, when I was growing up, my parents got divorced when I was very young, and I grew up in a house with my mother and my grandmother. My grandmother was very old school, very strict, but at the same time, when she would tell you to do something, but she had very little patience. I had 30 other plus cousins by the time I came along. They had already wore her patience thin. If she said do something, if she told you to do it the second time, she was getting up out of her chair or whatever, and she's moving in your direction. And I learned at a very young age, very quickly, that, you know, what was gonna happen next. So whenever she said to do something, I knew if I did not do what she said, when she said it, there would be a penalty to pay. You go into school where now the teachers cannot discipline children that same way, but the kid comes from a household that's run this way. This is what the kid knows. And if there's no consequences, the kid just keeps doing whatever they normally do. They're being a kid. They don't know any better. Teachers are not taught many times that the way that you talk to them and the way that you interact with them matters. Yes, you may be a really good teacher at, you know, teaching whatever your subject matter is, but can you communicate? This is the same with policing. They may be a very good police officer, investigator, all these kind of things. But when they're communicating to people, and I had these discussions many years ago when I was in the Indiana National Guard, and I was talking in a training school and talking to one of the instructors who was an Indianapolis police officer. I asked him one day, I said, why is every time I get pulled over, the police officers get out of their car, they walk up to the car, and the first thing they do is unsnap their gun. This is back when they had that leather strap over the gun, holding it in the holster. I said, you know, why do they do that? I said, it just pisses me off when I'm sitting there and this guy unstraps his pistol. Well, they need to be prepared. They don't know what's gonna happen or not. I said, I don't know what you're gonna do. I said, when you unsnap that gun, I said, I feel threatened because now you have unstrapped it, you can pull it out, you know, shoot me with it, no matter what I do. And at first, for the longest in this discussion that we were having, he couldn't understand what I was getting at. I said, but when you walk up to me and before you say hello, or before you ask for my license, you unsnap your gun, I become defensive because you unsnap that gun first. To me, that is a threat. And he said, I shouldn't feel that way. I said, how should I feel? I don't know you. I don't know, you know, if you're having a bad day, you know, you're gonna mistake me or whatever. I know you unsnap that gun. It only means one thing to me. You unsnap it so you can get it out. And trying to get him in, I still know this guy, and we're talking 30, almost 40 years later, I still know this guy, and we've talked, and he said he's thought many times about what I said. He said he can understand now why someone may feel threatened by that action. He said he never saw it as a threat. He just saw it as, you know, good police procedure to unsnap it, have it ready. I said, but that signals to the other person what your intentions may be. We don't understand, and this is police culture again, in their mind, you know, that's, and they teach each other this. Now today, how they do it, I don't know. I mean, that was how they were doing it then, and he said he was trained to do it that way. Is to actually, you know, unsnap his gun, be prepared, be ready. I've even seen some get out of the car and walk up with their gun in their hand.
Jeannie has another question in
Okay.
the chat for you.
Yes, it says, if time permits, one more question. You mentioned the often antagonistic us versus them nature of police culture. How might this adversarial type of mentality be changed? What kind of educational curriculum and training might reshape or improve police culture?
Wow. I'm not sure. You need to talk to the psychiatrist or sociologist more about that, of how you would screen for the personality types, because that's what we're talking about. Some personalities are much better at this than others, and how you figure out who they are, I don't know. One of the things that we should consider is there are retirement ages. I think police officers can retire at 55, is that after 20, 25 years, most of them probably should go find something else to do, because they have changed. The job has changed them. The job has changed. It's time to step away. I think the same for teachers, because I've had some very bad experiences with teachers who had stayed a little too long and had very selfish ideas, if you will. So how we change it, what would I suggest? I don't know. This is one of those things that we as a society needs to sit down and start thinking through. What do we want in a police officer?
I think about how, again, I'm going back to the idea of culture. I think about how police officers are represented in our media, particularly our films. Many of the films that we have, popular films, like with Mel Gibson and these guys, they're represented as road cops. And those road cops are celebrated. And we have Homeland Security here, and I can see where a lot of young people entering into that profession adapt some of that ethos, going into where that road cop in the pursuit of justice transcends the law.
But as you're pointing out, they're coming in, these young people coming in with some of this already in their mind or the back of their mind. And what's even worse than like Mel Gibson is the old Dirty Harry movies of the 1970s, you know, where he's carrying one of the movie starts out, this is a 44 Magnum. It's the most powerful handgun in the world, and it will blow your head clean off. What message does that send when this is a police officer, a TV movie police officer, who starts the film off telling you how big a gun he's carrying and just how deadly it is? What does that say about the police officer and the story that's going to unfold when you think about, I've gotten to know a lot of older police officers who retired, who said that in their career, they never once pulled their gun out. In the line of duty, they never once had to do that. They used it at the range, but they never used it on anybody. Flip side, I know of at least two. One I know of shot and killed somebody, and it was in self-defense, and he paid a price for what he did, for shooting this person. But he felt his life was threatened. He has the scars on his arm to prove when this person swung a 2x4 with nails in it and ripped into his arm, his forearm, and he said he shot the man in self-defense. It was a white cop. He shot a black guy. I have no reason to believe that he did not do it in self-defense, but he still paid a price for shooting a black guy who technically was unarmed, but he's got a 2x4 with nails in it. And some people say, well, the scratches weren't all that bad. You know, I don't know. I wasn't there. I take him at his word. I don't think that he's any kind of a racist. Did he shoot too quick? I don't know. I wasn't there. But there are other cases, like I said with George Floyd, those other ones, which clearly, you know, things have gone too far. And let me say this, while they're doing that, and we didn't talk about it, the courts become problematic because police, the sheriff, law enforcement in general, I'm talking about, are an extension of the courts. The judge and the prosecutors are not going to go out there in the street and roll around the street with someone who commits a crime. They basically are, they're not that kind of person. They don't have it in them to go out here and roll around. So if this guy does, then I'm going to take his side. That's how they're seeing this. And many times they have gone along with what the police officer said, whether it made sense or not. He's given the benefit of the doubt. When you do that, and then you scale that up to the number of people we're talking about, this one case, benefit of the doubt, but then we scale it up to all these ones, it starts becoming problematic. And this is where the judges and the prosecutors really need to stop and think about what it is they're doing. And I'll even go this far. We got a guy running for governor right now, and his campaign ad says, "I'll always back the blue." That is a problematic statement. I'm not anti-police, but what I am saying is that there are times when some police officers do things they shouldn't do, and oftentimes other police officers know this person is a problematic officer. They just don't say anything until something terrible happens.
When you elevate the police officer, you inadvertently demonize
Everybody else,
especially when they roll up on a suspect. So that creates
or an assumed suspect.
So that creates that them against us sort of thing. And again, it's sort of perpetuated in the media, like
it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that people say this is what's going to happen, and then the police officer rolls up, like you said, and it all goes bad, but then he's been taught that it's gonna go bad, these people are bad, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that we do this and this is the outcome. And then as a society, we accept it. Why do we accept this kind of a violent outcome repeatedly?
I guess that's what we need to address. To get at David's question, how do we fix that? It's our approach to the suspect, our approach to the human nature, if you will. You know, like I said, the culture itself has a certain assumption about the individual. We say we're innocent until proven guilty, but really, in the court of public opinion, is you're guilty until proven innocent. And then the cop is, or the law enforcement is presented as the good force, and you have to prove yourself to not be the evil force. So humanizing the humans in these situations as opposed to demonizing them. I think that, and that's a cultural thing, whether it's in the classroom or whether it's in.
And that's why I said the police officers are a subset of the larger society. And society needs to understand, not all police officers are bad. Policing is not bad, but there are problems in it that we need to understand and recognize. And then how do we deal with it? Police officers are human. They make mistakes. They sometimes do things that are wrong. We need to understand that. And some of what we're talking about now, you talk about how far back it goes, you can actually take it back to the dime store novels, you know, that were written in the 19th century about, you know, the sheriff, you know, and, you know, how Wyatt Earp was made such a hero in the late 19th century with the shootout the OK Corral and all that. When you read about that incident, and Earp and his brothers were not the shining knights that they have been portrayed to be, but people who write these stories make them out to be heroes. People who write some of these stories sometimes make other people out to be villains. What I find interesting in doing this is, take John Dillinger, for instance. If you go up to Lake County, to Crown Point, where that's the county seat of Lake County, last time I was there, the old county jail is still there. And now it's become a John Dillinger museum. Why are we celebrating John Dillinger? John Dillinger killed at least one police officer we know. He shot and killed a police officer in Lake County, I forgot the name of the town, robbing a bank. But we have museums to John Dillinger and all the other gangster era, you know, villains. But you take Jesse Coe and George Williams, for example. Those two were demonized, and their names are not even spoken anymore. And you saw that photograph where you had hundreds, if not thousands, of people show up to see his bullet-riddled body as some type of a freak show. And I'd be willing to bet you, if you had charged admission to get to see that, people would have been willingly paying money to see it. If they had time, someone would have set up and started selling soft drinks and hot dogs, and people would have bought that. We turned it into a carnivalized show. Why is that? You know, that's a problem with the larger society that the police are working under. This is, you know, what they do. So we, like you said, celebrate many of the police officers, and then we turn around, we celebrate some of the criminals. And you know, what's wrong with society? Yes, ma'am.
One of the things that I think about, we talk about the culture of policing. In the 60s and probably up to the early 70s, at least in Indianapolis, there was a program called Officer Friendly. And the officers would come into the classroom and talk to the children. And that way you saw them from a child's perspective. What I witnessed was you saw them as a person. And they, you know, they talk about what police officers did, and, you know, maybe mention they had a family and, you know, a child of a certain age. So it started out, at least, you know, in that era, where they were trying to reach out to people, at least the children in the community, to see them as, you know, somebody that was there to help you. And then we go, say, 10, 15 years later, and it's totally flipped. You don't hear anymore about Officer Friendly coming into the schools, you know, meeting with the children at a young age. You see police officers in the schools policing.
Yes.
And you hear stories about, children getting handcuffed and marched out and not given that grace of, they did something wrong, but they're kids.
Yes.
What did they do that would escalate a child be arrested and, carted out in handcuffs? That just, and this is in the span of 20 years. Where did we go from being officer friendly to being, I'm gonna take you to jail because you won't sit down and shut up? It's just, and that's a cultural thing that I think we need to work on.
I grew up in Detroit in the 70s and 80s. And, the Detroit riots was in the late 67. And Mayor Young came in on that wave. And one of the first things that he did was require that city workers live in the city, which transformed the police, which started that riot, transformed the police force, because now it became predominantly Black. You had a Black police chief and that sort of deal. And that makes a difference in the sense that those who police, quote unquote, police the community are members of the community. And one of the things I noticed coming to this small town is that many of the police officers here are from here. They went to the high schools, they know the judges, they know the lawyers, they even know people who they are policing. Whereas in Detroit, even now, because they rescinded that rule, Dennis Archer came in and said, you don't have to be. And so you saw immediately that the police officers don't live there, you don't recognize them, and they're not Black. So when you have 7 or 8 cops coming into your neighborhood, it seems like an occupation.
Isn't Marion County like that though? Now, Indianapolis, don't they require them to live in the?
In most places where they have those kind of rules, they've been challenged and they've been, as he said, done away with one way or another. Indianapolis is another one. One of the most recent fights about that was take-home cars. Indianapolis Police Department, every police officer is assigned a vehicle. And he takes the vehicle home every evening or whenever he's off shift. Well, we had a few of them who lived in the next county. And people started to complain, and the police department, said, okay, you can take home a vehicle unless you live in the next county, and you can't do that. And then there was a fight about that, whether or not, you can do that. And for people like me, the question became, okay, now you're taking this vehicle home and the vehicle has to be maintained and fueled. So now you're driving it farther, every day out of the county and back. That's fuel and that's wear and tear on that vehicle. Why should we be paying this extra as taxpayers to this person who lives in another county? So it became the same kind of a question as to whether or not you do this, why you do it, why you should not do it. And right now, Indianapolis, people who live outside of the county, last I heard, cannot take a vehicle home. Those who do live in the county can take a vehicle.
I only mention it because I know someone who has worked up there and they were for the jail system. She wasn't a police officer and they were requiring her to live there.
Okay, they may have reinstated the rule, I'm not really sure. But last time I really heard that fight, it was the take-home vehicles. These people are actually living outside of the county and whether or not they can take the vehicle home.
And then the city of Indianapolis, they have Unigov.
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
Unified government.
Unified government, which encompasses several small communities, all now in Indianapolis, Beach Grove, Speedway. I don't know if it goes as far down as Greenwood.
No, Greenwood is in Johnson County. It excludes, there are 4 excluded cities, I remember correctly. Beach Grove, Lawrence, Speedway, and Homecroft, Southport. That Homecroft, Southport, I don't even know the exact boundaries of that, but those are the 4 excluded cities inside of Marion County. What they did was extend the city boundaries to the county line, and the city and county government combined to make one government. But when they did that, they excluded those 4 communities. They're separate cities. Then you had, there's 9 townships in that county and 11 school districts. And all of those school districts still operate independently. And that's what got them in trouble in the federal courts with segregation and all those kind of things in the 1960s. It's still a problem. When they created Unigov, they intentionally excluded the 11 school districts. And they knew it would be problematic, and the judge pointed out to them, this is problematic. If you made them one, you would not have a problem. What made it even worse was that Indiana in the 1960s went around the entire state and required every one of these counties with all these little independent school districts to consolidate. And that's why we used to these big yellow buses that say consolidated school district of, what is it, Vigo County? Or this is Knox County.
This is Knox, yeah.
Yeah, and you'll see those buses say consolidated school district of Knox County. The state forced all these little school districts to combine into one larger district. And that's true, I believe, in 91 of the 92 counties in Indiana. The 92nd one, being Marion County, was excluded because they were so big and they had things under control. They didn't have the little one-room schoolhouses that still existed in some of the more rural areas. And that became problematic. And that is another part of the problem with policing. You start off with these kids being brought up through these systems and these different schooling systems that now come into these policing systems. That you run in Indianapolis and Marion County, you've got Speedway Police Department, Lawrence Police Department, Beachboro Police Department, Indianapolis Police Department, the Marion County Sheriff's Department. In one county, and now we're combining finally the fire departments. The township fire departments, one by one, have been pulled into the Indianapolis Fire Department, where they're becoming just one larger fire department that's more easily managed rather than having all these different ones. And that becomes complicated because in a larger metropolitan area like that, if you have a major fire, oftentimes you have departments that are crossing boundaries to, assist, to put out a fire. And remember a couple of years ago, there was a fire there at a big Amazon warehouse in Indianapolis, and it made the national news. The reason I bring that up is that's basically Plainfield in Hendricks County. The Indianapolis Fire Department crossed into the next county to help them put that fire out because they needed the extra manpower and the extra equipment because the fire was so big. Plainfield was growing so fast that they didn't have enough firemen to cover the area. And then when that fire happened, pretty much all of their fire department was drawn into that one fire. What happens if another fire breaks out? Or if there's an accident, all our people are over here on this fire. So Indianapolis Fire Department, with just a phone call, sent several trucks and people out there. But if they go out to Hendricks County and get injured, how does that work with workers' compensation and all those kinds of things we have to think about? What happens if someone wants to sue because they were injured by a fireman from Indianapolis in Hendricks County? So all these things have to be worked out. All these agreements have to be signed and thought about. But and it's the same issue inside of Marion County. When they start going between townships, they have all these mutual aid agreements already in place just because of things like that. A couple of years ago, a junkyard caught fire. And one of the things they did when this fire happened was the Speedway Fire Department got called because it gave them a chance to come into Indianapolis and work on a large industrial fire, which they don't get a lot of time to do that, and work with the Indianapolis Fire Department. The Indianapolis Airport Fire Department joined in because they don't get a lot of practice on working on these big industrial type fires with chemicals burning, things like that, like you would have in an airplane accident. So they called and sent some of their people just for the practical experience of working with another fire department, but working on an industrial fire. But that had to be thought out before it happened. So they would think, hey, let's call these guys up and give them a chance to use some of their training. Indianapolis didn't need the help, but it was bringing those folks in to this active fire and letting them actually do what they've been trained to do. So when Unigov, like I said, when it was done for a lot of reasons, many of them nefarious. And we are still suffering with those kind of things, policing being one of them. Up until 2007, you had a separate sheriff and police department that both patrolled the same county. And depending on where you were in the sheriff's jurisdiction or the city's jurisdiction, and how the sheriff and the city enforce the same rules and laws varied, but depending on which side of the street you were on. Literally, when you crossed the street, you crossed out of Indianapolis jurisdiction And in the sheriff's jurisdiction, where the sheriff may not apply the same law as harshly as the city and vice versa. So Unigov could be a good thing. It can also be problematic. And back to policing, we don't think about that was thought about then, it's not thought about now. Now all of Marion County is policed by Indianapolis Police Department, with the exception of Beach Grove, Speedway, and Lawrence. Homecroft, one of their officers was killed several years ago in a shooting, and they disbanded their police department, so now Indianapolis patrols that. But you still have these other 3 smaller police departments that run around in Marion County. Thank goodness we have the Indiana Law Enforcement Academy, where now police departments from across the state of Indiana that do not have training academies send their new recruits to the Law Enforcement Academy, where they are trained on how to be a police officer. Indianapolis operates its own academy. It's been doing it for 40-some years now, because the police department was so big and they couldn't wait to get people into the state academy, and they only have so many seats and all those kind of things. They put Indianapolis in a bind. They said, we got a big enough police department, we can do our own. And the state said, okay, yes. They developed their own plan. Indianapolis got blessed to have their own police training academy. So all the Indianapolis police officers are trained the same way by the same people. Everyone else in the state is trained by the Indiana Law Enforcement Academy, which is kind of under the Indiana State Police's umbrella. So they're all kind of trained the same way, which hopefully will eliminate some of these other problems we've been talking about. But there again, you're talking about police culture, and these programs are run by, veteran police officers, and some of them have these mindsets that, you need to do things. One of the things I like to point out to people, if you watch their training and they're honest about it, what they'll do is they have a shoot, don't shoot scenario where you stand in front of a big screen like this and you have a toy gun, and different scenarios are played out, and you have to decide whether or not you're going to shoot this person. And you only get a split second to make a decision. To me, that's a bad way of doing it, because now you've made this young police officer, drill in his head. You have to be ready to shoot at a moment's notice, a split second, shoot. And in that split second, if your isms, your sexism, racism, whatever your ism is, should happen to take over, you will split secondly decide to do something that was probably the wrong decision. But you were trained to do this. And I find that training problematic. I was trained to do this in the Army, shooting at targets, and we shot at pop-up targets. And the whole idea of using a pop-up target, it's a silhouette. That is to condition you to not hesitate when you see a human form, that you will shoot at it, because you're repeatedly trained on the rifle range to shoot at this human form when it pops up. And when you hit it, it drops back down. And the system's designed that sometimes they can lock it up so you can hit it and it won't go down. Then you fire at it multiple times, and then eventually they'll let it drop. And they specifically did that because they figured out from the Civil War coming forward that soldiers oftentimes hesitated. In the Civil War, they found out that some soldiers had loaded a rifle when you had the muzzle loaders, you had to drop the ball and the powder and all that, pack it in, had done that 4 or 5 times. They kept, and then they would pack another one in. The mistake they made, they didn't put a primer on it to fire it. So the person was assuming that they had fired the shot. Others, just would not fire at another human being. It's a natural response not to kill another person. We're taught. Take an 18, 19-year-old, tell them, go out there and start killing. For some people, this is problematic. Part of the conditioning is the U.S. Army uses silhouettes, human silhouettes, and you're trained to shoot at those. If you take this concept one step further, and now we've got a video with a person, some of these videos, the person does pull a pistol, and basically shoot at you. Others, they're not armed, but they make a move or whatever, and the police officer shoots them. Well, you get a bad grade for that, but nobody's harmed. My point is when you repeatedly train people to do this, some of them will shoot without thinking. They think they've seen a gun. They already see me as a threat. If you remember the Michael Brown incident, and Michael Brown, one of the things the police officer said was he was so afraid of him because he was so large. Michael Brown was 6'3", 6'4", close to 300 pounds. To him, he was a humongous monster. He felt like he had to shoot him because of his size. The police officer never saw a weapon, and in the end, Michael Brown was not armed. But when you get a person who is somewhat hesitant or who is, doesn't know, doesn't understand, doesn't like African Americans, Native Americans, Mexicans, you name it, whatever that is, it might be, and they're put in that situation, they may, without thinking, shoot. It's not necessarily a malicious act, but it is wrong. And then how do we, as a society, deal with that? And this is, I think, where we are at this point, is trying to figure out what do we do? What is appropriate? What is inappropriate? And unfortunately, there's not a lot of really good answers. But I think the first thing is to actually sit down and acknowledge that there is a problem, in that it's a human problem. We can all do this. As much as I may think about it, as much as I've read into this, I could possibly be provoked into making a bad decision easily. We're all human. But anytime you have a police culture that all but denies that they're human, that they're not perfect, that they know best and you can't, understand because you're not a police officer, that's problematic. Only another police officer can judge a police officer. That's problematic. That's the same problem we have with lawyers and doctors when they screw up, but yet they go in front of a committee of doctors or lawyers, and then they decide, and the general public, oh, you can't weigh in on this. You don't understand. You could not understand what it takes to be a lawyer or what it takes to be a doctor. That's, again, problematic because this person is a part of the larger society, and society needs to be able to weigh in. And that's where we are with a lot of policing issues, is a larger society is not weighing in. And when they go to court, the courts are not holding them responsible. If you can even get them into court to start with, the prosecutors oftentimes won't take the case.
Well, if there's no other questions, I don't think there's any more online. Anybody here have anything? Not seeing anything. So, anyway, thank you so much. Interesting, and we just really appreciate it. We actually had 13 people, so we have several online in here, and believe it or not, that's not a bad turnout for around here. But we will also be posting it on Facebook, so through Facebook, on YouTube, okay, all that. And hopefully we'll get some more views out of that too. But getting lots of thank yous online. Thank you. It was really great. Thank you.
I'm glad you like. Not many people want to hear me prattle on about police.